In the beginning, God created the temple. Approaching Zion, Temple Talk, episode 4. Man,
I think it's been, how many weeks has it been since we recorded?
That's what I was about to say. We're going to be a little rusty here. All right? We're going to be a little rusty. It's been a few weeks. We're 3 hours apart, time zones now. Planning is just the worst. But here we are. We're doing it.
If we had waited any longer, we may have forgotten how to podcast altogether. It may just completely fall into the wayside.
Yet to be seen.
It could still happen. You're right. Shouldn't get ahead of myself.
All right. Today we're talking about creation, Garden of Eden, and the fall of Adam and Eve, which are very much temple themes. And I started the podcast saying, in the beginning, God created the temple. And that's true in so many ways, many different ways. And maybe we'll get into some of those themes today. Kick off the title screen here. Creation, Eden, and the fall. So up to this point, what have we looked at? We talked about ancient temples in general, the abstract idea of what a temple is. That was episode 1. Then we talked about, in episode 2, how to approach temple worship. And specifically, we spent a lot of time on the idea that temple is about priesthood initiation. So understanding how to be part of Christ's priesthood order is a very important part of understanding temple worship and what we're doing in the temple and why we go to the temple and how the temple is supposed to impact us outside the temple, which perhaps is where actual worship happens in day-to-day life. Episode 3, then, we stepped into the temple to begin talking about ordinances. So we talked about initiatory ordinances. We talked about baptism and confirmation as initiatory ordinances. Those are initial ordinances before the temple initiatory ordinances, if that makes sense. I think it made sense when we talked about it in the episode. And then we talked about temple washing, temple anointing, and temple clothing, and garments of the priesthood and temple ceremonial clothing, and a few things like that. And that leads us up to today's episode, which is the theme of creation, Garden of Eden, the fall, Adam and Eve. And this is really, thematically, the beginning of what we would call the endowment ordinance. And, technically, the endowment starts in the initiatory. You could probably argue the endowment starts at baptism. If you wanted to go abstract. Don't forget to take yourself off mute when you talk.
Thanks. I see you are rusty.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I agree. You could start the endowment process clearly at baptism. That is the gate.
If you really wanted to go abstract, you could start the endowment at birth. Okay.
How far back we got to go here?
If you really want to go abstract, you could start the endowment at the creation of all things. And now we've looped back around to where we started, at creation.
To the endowment is everything. Is that where we're headed?
I was thinking about it because in the temple we perform all these ordinances. One of the ordinances we perform is parent-child sealings. And generally ordinances have to go in order. You're baptized and then you're confirmed. And if you're doing, vicarious ordinances in the temple, you do initiatory first, and then you do endowment, and then you do sealings, right? There's an order to how the ordinances go. But parent-child sealings are interesting because you could do it at the end, or you could do it as an initial ordinance. And I was thinking on that, and I realized if you're born in the covenant, that's your first ordinance, because you're immediately sealed to your parents, like through birth itself. Like birth is the ordinance of sealing children to parents. So technically, your endowment process starts when you're born, if you're born in the covenant, at least. That was not planned to talk about. How's that for just kicking things off hot? You like
I
that?
think we're in a good place to get going. Yeah.
You like that? All right. I brought that up to the temple sealer. He just looked at me like I was crazy. He's like, "What are you talking about?" I was like, "All right."
We're all at different stages of the path, Dylan. Don't be judgmental, okay?
He gave me that look like, "What have you been smoking?" Oh, it's like these are important things you need to know. All right. Let's jump in. And creation itself is it's a very big part of the temple experience. Okay. Like a good like 20, let's see, it's like 30% of the endowment is talking about creation. Okay. And a couple of years ago it was like took like an hour to get through. They repeated everything multiple times to make sure you were listening. And it is something that has the fact that it's so prominent in the experience of the temple, it has caused me to ponder on it quite a bit. Like why is it so important to go through this idea of creation as part of the temple experience? And interestingly, we have multiple creation narratives. Like this creation story it's everywhere, especially in our church, in our religion. It's everywhere. So we have Genesis chapter 1, right? The creation of the world. We have Moses and the Pearl of Great Price, which is the Joseph Smith translation of Genesis. We have creation again in Abraham. Then we have the endowment ordinance itself, which is our modern temple experience. And then, I mean, you find it told like throughout the Book of Mormon, for example, like Alma and his sermons, and throughout the scriptures, you see these things, John chapter 1, right? You see it come back up throughout the scriptures in so many different places. So obviously it's important. It's a very big deal. All right. And the idea we're getting at here, and this is not novel, new from us. This is an idea from even non-LDS scholarly thinking. But you look at like Genesis chapter 1, and it has been identified that, yes, this was a temple text. Like since early days, this idea of telling the creation of the earth and the creation of man, it was part of the ancient temple tradition. And so we have to start looking into why. Like what are these prophets trying to accomplish by giving us this experience of creation in our temple ordinances?
It's interesting too. Two thoughts real quick. One is along the lines of what you said, as the temple endowment has been shortened and streamlined, maybe as it has become more efficient. It is interesting that the creation portion of the endowment, other than the repetitive nature that used to exist previously, as you pointed out, they have not really removed or reduced a lot of the creation narrative that exists in the endowment. So to your point, there's clearly a reason that they have the brethren and the leaders of the church have chosen to allow the emphasis to remain regarding the creation narrative. So that's important one to think about is, yeah, they continue to simplify, you might say, the endowment experience, but the creation narrative is still a very central and key focus of the endowment experience. The second thing is, it is interesting, and we take this very much for granted in the church, but the creation narrative, like just the true application of that, really is something that differentiates and is a radical departure from what mainstream Christianity would consider when it comes to creation. Because we very clearly, it's outlined that God did not create something out of nothing, that it was more of an organizational process, that part of his exaltative power is to take chaos or matter that is unorganized and to organize it, which is a very radical and important difference that we have from our beliefs in the nature of God than what mainstream Christianity has, where God is a being and an entity that we can never fully approach or understand, and that he is able to magically um, create these things out of absolutely nothing. But that makes him so unapproachable as well. And so the beauty in the creation narrative, and even from the very beginning, how it starts is this God the Father and Jesus Christ are beings that we can relate to, that we can understand, that you have so much more in common with them than the rest of Christendom would typically concede and give us credit for, you know. Now that certainly doesn't bring God the Father and Jesus Christ down. It certainly does, in my opinion, it certainly does mean we have far more potential than a lot of people generally would consider, you know, and we should not live below that privilege and that potential that we've been given. But it really, you know, it's easy for us to go to the temple and to begin participating in the endowment section and then say, oh, I've heard this 1,000 times, you know, and really not consider the depth and the eternal um, implications that what the creation narrative provides for us in our relationship with the Father. So I just want to set that stage before we get going here. Not something to trivialize and not something we should take so lightly, even though it's something we've been taught, you know, for those of us that have grown up in the church our whole lives. You know, seems second nature, but for many, many people, this is a pretty radical departure from their understanding of God and the nature of Godhood.
Yeah, they don't dim the lights anymore, so it's harder to sleep through the first part of the session.
That was definitely revelation when that came up. Whatever conversation was going on when that came up. Let's forego the light dimming. Ah, brilliant. Let's get rid of that.
Our members need an assist here. They need a little extra help getting going. All right, let's talk about the different creation narratives here, because at a high level, they're all similar. God's creating the earth. He creates Adam and Eve, right? But they're actually very different, which could be confusing because it's like you have all these inconsistencies between different versions of creation. So like if one's slightly different than the other, like what does that mean? Is one wrong? Is the other one more correct? Well, what's going on? Well, what we have is a prophet. Like each one of these creation narratives is a prophet going through this narrative for a specific audience. And we see this in all sermons. We see this throughout the Book of Mormon, where like Alma, like he teaches similar things to different audiences, and he changes it slightly. Like this is this is normal, right? This is preaching by the Spirit in the moment. And we have versions of the creation narrative which were given and have been revealed for slightly different purposes, for slightly different audiences. So we have Genesis, which is Old Testament, and we get a view of creation from a very Old Testament approach, where you have revelation given to Israel at a time when they're rejecting the Melchizedek priesthood and the idea of a Messiah. Okay, and we know from the Book of Mormon that plain and precious parts of the Bible have been altered and removed. So we get this kind of plain creation narrative in the Bible, which almost would make you think it's talking about the creation of the planet. And people have lost themselves in this debate of like trying to fit the Genesis narrative into science, into physics, and explain how the world was created. And it's just a mess. And it was not the intention of what Moses was doing when he was talking about the creation. we have the Book of Moses, which Joseph Smith then takes Genesis and he says, let's ramp this up a bit. Let's get a fresh set of prophetic eyes on this. And he translates, quote unquote translates, if that's what you want to call what Joseph Smith was doing to the Bible. I think it's much cooler than translation. If you're translating English to English, is it translation? I think it's just revelation. All right. But you have the Book of Moses, which gives the creation narrative in Eden and Garden of Eden, etc., and it puts it through a Christian lens. It makes it very clear that the gospel of the Son of God, the priesthood order of the Son of God, has been part of the plan of salvation from the beginning. So we have Book of Moses, and then we have very clear commentary, you can say, in this revelation for Joseph Smith, that part of Adam and Eve's instruction from the Lord was about the law of sacrifice and about a Savior being provided and looking forward to Christ. So even though we have these Old Testament ordinances and we have animal sacrifices and we have these ideas still showing up, and Joseph Smith's translation makes it very clear that no, the prophets understood the Melchizedek priesthood. The prophets of old, they understood everything they were doing was pointing towards Christ, towards a literal Messiah that was to come, towards the ordinance of the atonement that he would perform. And that is the mechanism of redemption for mankind. So Moses opens our eyes and almost gives us a New Testament view of the Old Testament story, narrative of Genesis. Then we have the Book of Abraham, which is crazy. You have this like Egyptian view on creation, where now we're talking about the gods, plural, and it goes into like intelligence and degrees of intelligence, and it just goes. So we have this expansion of ideas that's coming out of this idea of the creation narrative. And the idea there is, I mean, clearly the idea of the Book of Abraham is how Abraham might have taught these ordinances or these ideas to the Egyptians, perhaps based on religious ideas that they already held, and he would take what they already, what they knew to be true, and he mixed it in with the truth of the gospel, and you get the same story, you get the same doctrines being taught, but it's in a different context, and it helps you understand different things in different ways. And just because it's presented differently doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means, hey, here's a different way of approaching this for a certain audience that can help expand your mind, expand your spiritual growth and potential, and just think about things completely differently. And then, of course, we have the endowment, which is our living model, right? This is the creation narrative we get in the temple that is inspired by our living priesthood. And as we've seen, especially in recent times, but as we've seen since the 1800s, the living prophet, using his priesthood keys, can adapt and adjust the administration of the temple ordinances to give emphasis on different parts and different places and different ways according to the times and the seasons and the needs of the members of the church in any given generation. So perhaps the endowment is always the most relevant version for us, because that's the one that's being administered to us today by living priesthood.
That's actually interesting because, well, I know you and I went through this when they recently, well, it seems like several times lately, they've continued to update the endowment presentation, and things have been removed and taken away that we used to really like, we used to really appreciate. But again, they're going to make edits, updates, and adjustments for the time and the day and the audience intended to receive it, and exactly as you pointed out, when you look at the creation narrative in Genesis, obviously, as part of the Old Testament, it really highlights that covenantal relationship and identity that God has with Israel. There's clearly an influence there, that there's a covenantal relationship here with, starting with Adam, down to Abraham and kind of the covenant relationship that's interwoven all throughout the Old Testament, you know. And then in the Moses account, you really get a lot more of kind of the human experience, the human relationship to God, you know, and kind of not completely, but a very different perspective in how Moses communicates the creation narrative. And then in Abraham, you get more about the divine councils that were taking place and this premortal planning and just a deeper look, or maybe a different look into the eternal round, you know, and how these things happen and how these things go about occurring, you know. And so it is interesting how you consistently see the different perspectives. And then when you layer them on top of each other, you really get a very deep, instructive account of the creation narrative. And that's more or less what you kind of get in the endowment today. It really is kind of a combination, or the best of all worlds, maybe, where we take the best parts of each narrative and we weave it into the endowment presentation today. And so maybe we're the luckiest of all generations, where we get to cherry pick what do we like the most about any or all of these creation narratives. And that's a good thing. That's a very positive thing for us, so that we get a more holistic view of the eternities than perhaps any other generation ever has, you know, at any time in the past. Maybe we're kind of getting the best of that. It makes me think of, I believe it's Neil A. Maxwell. What did he say? That God is revealing or giving away the mysteries of the universe, or of eternity, basically.
Secrets of the universe, I think.
Yeah, there you go. Something like that. I need to memorize that quote because I loved it so much. But that's true. Like, I mean, it's just totally, completely being divulged. Hey, this is how this works. It's not complicated or complex.
And now a meme. So I've decided
Get this.
there's two ways to think about creation. Okay. And this is consistent with how Joseph Smith used the words earth versus the word world. So one way of thinking about creation is the creation of the earth as like a physical planet. If you're a glober. The creation of the earth, I mean, like the physical creation, the physics of it. God is combining the elements and turning it into a habitable place of living. Okay. That's the traditional way people think about reading Genesis, right? Joseph Smith used the word earth to represent the planet. Yes, planet Earth. And he would use the word world to refer to the posterity of Adam, the family of Adam, the people, right? His children. They would constitute the world. So when we're talking about the creation, I think it's much more meaningful and impactful and useful, especially from a temple perspective, to not think about the creation as we're being taught about how the physical dirt and water came together, but we're actually talking about the creation of the world, the creation of Adam and Eve, the creation of the children of God on the earth, how God's children and his priesthood came to be organized on the earth. And so when we go through these ideas and we're presented with 7 days of creation, you know, you don't have to have this stupid debate of, was it 7,000 years? Literally, you know, if one day to God's 1,000 years, then creation had to be 7,000 years, right? Like, you don't have to worry about that. Like, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a broader abstract concept that intelligence, which is eternal, organizes itself throughout different spheres of existence. And through a divine, natural biological process, this intelligence becomes organized into the image of God, man and woman. And that's something that is very mysterious at first. You think about, how did God create Adam and Eve? But then at the same time, it's something that's very second nature. Why? Because we do it. husband and wife, like mother and father. We have children. We organize intelligence into spirit and into physical children of God on the earth. We participate in this work of worldly creation, of creating the world. And when you go to the temple, like this, I'm starting with because the whole thing we're going to be talking about today is we need to change how we're thinking when we go to the temple. Like to learn how to learn from symbols and allegory, you have to understand what we're being presented is not facts. It's not literal factual knowledge. We're being presented narrative, allegory, divine symbols. And we're supposed to take those, liken it unto ourselves, and then internalize it and grow spiritually from that. One of the key phrases in the temple is consider yourself as if you were Adam and Eve. Like we're supposed to go into this creation narrative, this temple experience, with the mindset of, okay, we're learning about the creation, but I'm Adam. Like I'm going to put myself in his shoes. And what can I learn as I think about my creation and my experience on earth and my relationship to God and my fallen nature and what I need to return to God, right? I mean, the Hebrew word Adam means man, right? So I, as a man, as Adam, like, what is being taught to me to help me go through this process to grow into the likeness and image of God more fully and spiritually progress and obtain eternal life and exaltation?
I like to, I focus a lot when I'm in the endowment and kind of part of this, or what occurs shortly after this creation narrative, where, but it's very closely related, where God talks to Adam and references how, you were created out of the dust of the earth, and essentially says you will return to the dust of the earth. Save, of course, the whole point of that, save the intercession of Jesus Christ as a sacrifice, an eternal sacrifice, right? And it's this whole idea of,
Except the
if you look at
twinklers.
the creation,
The twinklers get a free pass.
there's always exceptions. There's always exceptions to every rule. It's this idea that line upon line creation, organization, meaning there has been a significant amount of effort and organization and planning and the process to get you to where you are. This is how I interpret it when God says, you're made from the dust of the earth, meaning you have been organized painstakingly into this form in which you currently exist as. In the creation narrative is kind of this line upon line building of organizing intelligence, and it's almost like God the Father is saying this would all be for naught. You would basically go back to nothing if it wasn't for the atonement of Jesus Christ. And so when we consider this creation narrative and the purposeful and intentional illustration of very methodical, line upon line, building one phase after another, that there's just painstaking work into this growth model, you get to this point in which, okay, now you are organized in a state in which you can, as you talked about, becoming like God or made in the image of God. And then what do we see shortly thereafter? Well, if it wasn't for Jesus Christ, that would all be for naught. It would all be wasted. There would be nothing more that God the Father could do for you. So something to consider as we think about this, the eternities that it has taken for us perhaps to get to the point in which we are, where we can be refined to be like God. And all of that work and effort would be wasted if it were not for the sacrifice and the atonement of Christ.
I have a note here, which I probably shouldn't even go into, but we talked about the 7,000 year cycles, and we say, so I threw that out the window already. I said that's trash. Okay, we don't even need to be worried about like the physical creation of the earth. All right, But there's still 70,000 year cycles. Like we have 7 days of creation. If each day is 1,000 years, well, we have the plan of salvation from Adam to the second coming to the millennial, which is 7,000 years, or approximately 7 God days. Okay. So what's interesting to see is that this whole idea of a 7,000 year cycle, it's not about creating a planet. It's about creating an exalted society, a Zion society. It's about the work and glory of God, exaltation, eternal life of man, over and over and over again. When we talk about these ideas of eternal round, meaning the plan of salvation, the work of God happens over and over and over again, you can start to have this bigger, broader, eternal round picture that, hey, this happens over and over and over again. Like there's a sequential eternal series of these 7,000 year cycles of humanities, of mankind, of Adam and Eve. And the work and glory of God is what? Bring the priesthood among fallen man, help man to enter into this priesthood order. Through the doctrine of Christ and this priesthood order, men improve themselves and become righteous and enter into salvation and exaltation. Rinse and repeat. That's the work and glory of God throughout the eternities, or from eternity to eternity. It's cyclical.
And that's best illustrated in the whole Enoch and Noah story and narrative, where one is building this celestial society that gets to return and be with God, and then Noah is left kind of holding the bag. It's like, well, I got to start it again. Why is Noah called the new Adam? Well, because he kind of had to kick off the next eternal round, so to speak.
You have the whole city of Enoch, like, we're going up to heaven, and then Noah's like, all right, let's do it. And they're like, actually, you have a special assignment.
Except you.
You get to build a boat.
Somebody's got to stay behind, bro. Sorry.
And Noah's like, why me? And they're like, because you're the best of us.
Yeah, that's what they would say.
It's a special assignment, Noah. Very important. But what do we see? Noah, who is essentially someone who, in the time of Enoch, is worthy of exaltation, or has his calling and election made sure. And what happens? He essentially has the privilege and burden of becoming a new Adam, of going into a wilderness, a fallen, lone and dreary world, and populating the earth. And all who will come forth is his posterity. I mean, Noah's a new Adam, essentially. So even from Adam to Noah, we have a mini representation of this entire cyclical eternal round, the plan of salvation, and how it works end to end. And takes us to our next slide here, which gives us a broader theme of how creation is designed to exalt man. So in Genesis and in Moses, I mean, in really in all the narratives, right? The creation shows us how eternal intelligence, right, pulling from Abraham, how internal intelligence is cycled through spheres of organization, or days, right, of creation, until it becomes created into the image of God, meaning intelligence that has the ability to discern good and evil, right? So in Moses 4:28, I, the Lord God, said unto mine only begotten, behold, the man is become as one of us to know good and evil. That's the key idea, what it means to be made into the image of God, is that we have agency, we have the ability to discern good and evil and choose one or the other. That is the image of God. That is what makes God God, is that he can discern good and evil and choose good. He perfectly chooses good. He perfectly understands the distinction and perfectly uses his agency to choose good. From there, being in the image of God, man can be given the opportunity to enter into the order of God, which is the priesthood order, the priesthood after the order of the Son of God. And that's what we see in the Book of Moses talked about, but we especially see this in the Book of Mormon, where Aunt Alma talks about the holy order of the priesthood and the priesthood after the order of Melchizedek, where we're told that the priests, those who enter into this priesthood, they're ordained after the order of God's Son, of the Son of God, and they become high priests forever after the order of the Son of God. And why do they do that? They do that to perpetuate the image of God and to be a model and a little representation, a symbol of Christ himself for their society, for their generation. So the order of God exists to further help exalt man, help him learn to use his tools of agency and discernment, and then to be able to preach and promote and propagate righteousness among their generation. And over time, perhaps over eternities even, through this priesthood order of God, man can then become like God. Meaning, through redemption and the proper use of agency, building character, integrity, spiritual strength, man can become like God through this priesthood order. And that's biblical. Beloved, this is 1 John 3, verse 2. Beloved, now are we the sons of God, and it doth not yet appear what we shall be, but we know that when he shall appear, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. Right? The whole purpose of creation is to get man into the priesthood, and the whole purpose of the priesthood is to assist man in becoming like God.
Yeah, I really like the way that you laid out this slide, because the whole concept, this basically simplifies the covenant path, right? I mean, this is exactly what the covenant path is aligned for. This idea of being made in the image of God and then entering into the order, the holy order that refines you to the point to then be like God. So image, order, and like. I just love how simple that is for people to understand exactly what the process is, the refinement process is that God is or has ordained for us to go through. And this idea, it's like this idea of progression and refinement is either so foreign to other Christians, or maybe a better way to look at it is so incomplete, because one of the things that people criticize us for as a faith is this idea of being like God. And there's a lot that's behind that statement. There's no need to go into that now,
That's
but
the best part.
there's a lot of criticism. Well, it is the best part. You're right. But there's a lot of criticism around that, and the fact that, yes, we have a doctrine that clearly leads to that. But the point is, there's a process, there's a plan, there's a program in place that facilitates an individual getting to that point. It's not this idea or this concept that, I'm just going to wake up one day and this is just going to be given to me, right? Like, that's clearly not what we teach. And I do fear sometimes that members of the church feel like, well, I can just not mess up and be a decent person, and then someday in the eternities, God's just going to say, here it is. You're just going to know it all. He's just going to give it to you. It's like, no, if that's how it worked, why wouldn't he have done that already? Like, he could have just given it to you a long time ago. No, there is clearly a process through agency that's used appropriately through the whole balance of justice and mercy and the plan of redemption and agency exercised. There is a process to allow individuals to go through this refinement cycle. And that's exactly what it is. And so it is interesting that we get criticized for a doctrine that actually you can see a lot of the underpinnings of this doctrine in the Bible, exactly where you're pointing out, where even the Bible kind of points out and highlights this refinement cycle that does get people to the point where John points out, like, you are, or you can be just like him.
And this is where plain and precious parts of the Bible being removed was so destructive to Christianity. Because we have a little bit of man being in the image of God in the Bible, and then we have a little bit of man can become like God in the Bible, but the details about man entering into the priesthood order is, it's especially New Testament, like it's been taken out, and in the terms of Melchizedek priesthood, it's not really in the Bible at all anymore. Only in little glimpses, and it was specifically removed, right, when corruption entered into the religions, Old Testament and New Testament. What the first thing that corruption does is it limits access, right? It becomes elitism, and this is what we saw happen from the Old Testament going into the New Testament, where you had the Pharisaical ruling class, the elites, the religious elites. And what was the criticism of Jesus? Like, you don't let people into the temple. You don't initiate people into the priesthood order. You hold it for yourself, and then you make no use of it. You don't promote righteousness with it. And then the same thing happened, after kind of the great apostasy, after the death of the apostles, is it became controlled. And now priesthood was only a very exclusive thing that certain leaders entered into, and it was no longer a universal priesthood, right? The whole reason Jesus went to the temple and threw tables, right? What was the point of that? Like, he was saying that, like, the priesthood is not being offered universally. Like, the blessings of the temple, of the priesthood order, are not being administered freely. So what did Jesus come to restore? The priesthood order, and give it freely. Like, that's what he was doing with all of with his entire work. That's what he was establishing. That's what he called his 12 apostles to go out and do, to preach the order of the Son of God, right? That it's been established, and call people into this order. You don't get that in the Bible. Now, history has been very kind to this concept, because you can find lots of early Christian documents now that, that show that, yes, early Christianity did continue these temple motifs and these themes and these ideas of washings and anointings to among the general member base of the church. But just strictly from the Bible, you don't. It's hard to get that out of the Bible if you're not looking for it, if you don't understand how it works already. Let me throw in one more little nugget. This is what happens when you don't give commentary. I get ideas.
Is this one for free? This is a free tip for everyone. Pro tip.
This is another little biblical nugget.
Okay, I'm interested.
It's fascinating. This is fascinating. When did God say man has become as one of us, to know good and evil? When exactly did that happen?
Ooh, let's see. It wasn't immediately after the fruit was partaken of.
But it was after.
It was after, yes. It was after.
That's the point I was getting at. Man sins, and then God comes and says, he's now as one of us, knowing good and evil. That's a very crazy idea. It's biblical, but it's a very crazy thing for God to say. Like, if you think about it, like, that's very... What an odd thing to say.
There's a lot of weight to that statement. Is that what you're saying? That's
now, am I suggesting that God has sin? I'm not suggesting that. What I'm suggesting is that God is a redeemed individual. And that is probably a very blasphemous thing to say among certain audiences. But I believe...
Not to Joseph Smith, it wouldn't be.
But I believe that's exactly what's implied when Adam... And they partake of the fruit, and they entered into the state of needing redemption. And God says, they have become as one of us, knowing good and evil. We can now offer them redemption and a path to truly become as we are, redeemed. There is, and that sounds crazy, because to be redeemed, that means at some point in the past you had sin. You needed to be redeemed. Okay, very strange idea when you're talking about God. But what it reveals is that the power of godliness comes from redemption, from being redeemed. Like the powers of godhood, like a prerequisite, a necessity to attain that power is being a redeemed individual.
Yeah, so I did not know you were going to go there, but since you went there, that idea that is conveyed in that statement, the whole concept of the atonement and how infinite and eternal truly is the atonement, and are there any limiting principles that apply to the atonement? Well, outside of an individual accepting and then aligning themselves with the ordinances required to fully partake of the blessings of the atonement, there really is no limiting principle placed upon it. And it what seems so blasphemous about your statement is like, well, how could that somehow being redeemed means there's still something slightly wrong with you, right? That's a very human perspective. Is like, well, you needed redeemed, and so there's still something wrong, even though you're better than you were, right? But that's us limiting the power of the atonement. In your statement, by saying like, hey, has God the Father also gone through this redemption process and cycle? The only thing that feels wrong about that is the natural man within us, the inability of us to truly believe something can be perfected. And once you are fully redeemed, once you are fully perfected, then there is no longer any flaw or any imperfection. You are made whole. And that is what the atonement is offering. That is what Christ is seeking for us. And so, your statement only sounds blasphemous on the surface, but when you really consider what we claim to preach about the atonement and the capabilities that an atonement can have on an individual, there is no difference between an entity that is perfect and an entity that goes through the process of atonement and becomes perfect. They are one and the same, and it matters not. You have the same power, you have the same authority, you have the same capabilities, the same attributes. It really isn't blasphemous, except our limited understanding of what atonement really is makes it perceive as such when you first hear something like that spoken. But clearly, Joseph Smith and several of his teachings, especially towards the end of his life, would not have found anything about that blasphemous, and would have found it in line with, in my opinion, in line with the eternal round that he was coming to understand or had already gained understanding of.
Yeah, because what you're saying is, if suggesting that God is a redeemed individual, if you have a problem with that idea, that means that you don't truly believe in the power of the atonement of Jesus Christ to redeem, or you don't understand what redemption actually means.
Yeah. You have automatically limited what Christ and the atonement are capable of. And that seems like a kind of an oxymoron for something we preach.
That's the blasphemy.
Yeah, that's the blasphemy. That's right. When we take it upon ourselves to instruct God and Jesus Christ what they can do for us. You're absolutely right.
All right, so let's talk about Adam and Eve. We do believe in a real Adam and Eve, that there was an Adam and an Eve. Like, there was somebody who was put in that position of populating the earth, so to speak. Like a Noah. Oh, I got a visitor here. And we say they were the first people on the earth. Okay, so that's fine. We can go with that. And we say they're the parents of all living. Okay, that's fine. We can go with that, right? That's a very literal interpretation of the creation narrative. Give me 1 second. Take it, Nathan.
No problem. No problem. This Y'all can see what we have to deal with just to try to fit in even an hour and a half worth of recording. This idea though of Adam and Eve being real people, yes, they were absolutely real individuals. But clearly the role of Adam and Eve, and that's exactly what it is a role that is repurposed over and over again. We talked about that earlier with kind of like Noah and his situation. Yes, we believe that there was a first people, first man and first woman, especially in the order or after the order of the Son of God. Like that is legitimate. But the intent is not to focus on a singular set of individuals. The intent is that this is a role that has to be kind of played over or played out over and over again. That there are always those who willingly enter into the holy order of guard. And it's actually instructive to us individually, because for many of us, we might be the first ones who are entering into that holy order of God for our family. And you really are essentially playing the role of Adam or Eve for your family and for your family tree, because you are the first to enter into the sacred ordinances and covenants that God has to offer, that holy order. And so in the temple, again, as you talked about, Dylan, when it's asking us, hey, consider yourself as if you are Adam and Eve, that can be a quite literal thing depending on the individual and the covenantal relationships that have been, or maybe not, developed in their family legacy. And maybe they are the first ones to enter into that order and provide salvation for their posterity and doing work for their ancestry as well.
Let's talk about Adam and Eve as the first people. So is it our doctrine that Adam was the first person? Or is it our doctrine that Adam was the first prophet that we know about? Okay, that's the question.
I think the primary song answers that one.
That's the question. Adam was a prophet, first one that we know. Okay. Leaves open the idea. Doctrinally, we have room here. Leaves open the idea that there could have been people before Adam. Our Adam. Like our priesthood patriarch, right? Of the world, of his posterity. Okay. Now, look what I pulled out of the woodwork here. Check out this Heber C. Kimball quote. Right, you know you're getting into trouble when you start pulling out Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball. The Garden of Eden was occupied in the morn of creation by Adam and his associates, who came with him for the express purpose of peopling this earth. And I would like to couple that with Moses 134, which says, "And the first man of all men have I called Adam, which is many." All right, is your mind blown? Is this completely tearing down the paradigms of the garden story?
I'm buying it, man. I'm all in. I'm drinking the Kool-Aid.
We talked about this idea of eternal rounds and these 7,000-year cycles, right? There has been and there will be people on the earth, okay? Man is eternal. We talk about God creating man, but man is eternal, right? Doctrine and Covenants, man too was in the beginning with God. If God is eternal and God was a man, then man has to be eternal. Okay? Like, you just have to wrap your head around that. Like, there, in the beginning, misnomer, right? There is no beginning. It's eternal. Okay? So we're not talking about the creation of a man that started it all. We're talking about the creation of an Adam. We're talking about the creation of a man made into the image of God. We're talking about the process of how a man can be chosen from the world, put into the order of Christ, and transformed into the likeness of God. But when we're talking about our Adam, we're talking about the first time this process was done in our eternity, in our cycle of the plan of salvation. And yes, there is an Adam. There is one man who had those priesthood keys for the world, a prophet, okay? A patriarch, a prophet, priest, and king over the earth and the priesthood. There was an Adam, but that doesn't mean there weren't other Adams at the same time. I mean, that's the Melchizedek order. Yes, there was a prophet, great prophet Melchizedek, but he went around giving Melchizedek priesthood to other people, like Abraham, right? So we had an Adam figure, Melchizedek, and he went around making more Adam figures, like Abraham. And that's how the work and glory of God works. And we see this hinted at in the temple narrative of creation, that it was kind of like this. And it's very subtle, and more so than ever today. And if I talk about it, it's probably a little spoiler if you haven't gone yet. But you go through this creation, you have Adam and Eve, in the fallen world, and they're working, and it kind of mentions the fact that Satan is loose in the world, right? Teaching false doctrines. It goes to this idea, and a question is posed to Lucifer, to Satan, like, what's being taught? And he goes, the philosophies of men, mingled with Scripture, and the question is, well, how is it received? And he says, very well, except these people, Adam and Eve, aren't interested in it, right? Because they're different. They're part of this other order where they're not picking up what I'm putting down. But it implies that even at the time of Adam and Eve, right, there was a fallen world in which Adam and Eve were introduced into. This is the big idea, right? Because that's where we find ourselves today. We're born into a fallen world where Satan is everywhere, and he's putting out crazy philosophies of men, sometimes not even mingled with Scripture. And the test is, are we picking up what he's putting down, or are we part of a different order where we seek righteousness and we follow what's been revealed through a priesthood order, through a prophet?
I know this is going to seem really out of left field and doesn't have a lot of spiritual backing. So now that I've caveated this next statement, one of the reasons why I always find I like watching and listening to a lot of the interviews that like Graham Hancock does about his theories of, kind of ancient civilizations having intelligence and knowledge far more sophisticated than we generally appreciate, and how to him in his study of history, how it almost seems like there have been these great civilizations that ultimately are destroyed, but that there seem to be individuals who come out of these civilizations that then pass on or share great wisdom and great knowledge with others that they come across, right? How true that is, who knows? I have no idea. It's great. It's entertaining. It's really fascinating to listen to. But I always in the back of my mind have this feeling of it's kind of like the eternal round, the gospel plan, where these civilizations, the righteous are ultimately taken, the wicked are left and destroyed, and then perhaps there are those who come out of it that have this knowledge, this sacred knowledge, that they then seek to share and administer to others who are willing to listen to it. And it's almost like you see a similar process in the Book of Mormon, where you have these great civilizations that individuals seek to come and provide salvation and redemption and the holy order of God and everything we've been talking about. And then and then of course they ultimately chose wickedness and were destroyed, except for the few that chose to be righteous. But it's just interesting how even throughout history, empirical evidence shows that it seems like there have been civilizations that have this great wisdom that has led to great discoveries and great abundance. And like, what is that? And my contention would be, what I would proffer is there's actually more of a spiritual component to that. There is an eternal, a doctrinal component to that these holy orders exist. When they're implemented and the people accept it, they prosper in the land, right? And then what happens once that's rejected? Well, that's how you go from an Adam character and righteousness and abundance to then getting to the point where you have Enoch and Noah. There are some who are righteous, and then the rest are so wicked they have to be destroyed, right? And then you have the Noah character who kind of reignites this process all over again. And so it is interesting how you have some evidence empirically that seems to support this idea of this kind of spiritual eternal round happening at the same time. And so I know that's a little bit out of left field, but it really does kind of align well with this creation narrative and the eternal round that we've been talking about today.
You want something out of left field?
You always one up me. There's always someplace crazier you're willing to go.
I'm particularly fond of the idea that Adam and his associates came in a moon space station to the Earth to populate the Earth.
This is the whole hollow moon theory? Is that what you're building witness?
You're getting it. You're getting it. Now.
I know. I've heard it all before. Trust me.
Now, where I came up with that, I have no clue.
So Adam and his associates rode on the moon, parked it just outside of Earth, and said, "All right, good enough.
We will go down.
Go down from here. We will go down."
That's right.
I like it. I can buy it.
Like all truths, it's much more plain and precious than that. Okay. The truth is much more plain and precious than anything like that. I just want to return back to the theme here. We're talking about Adam and Eve. We went through all this stuff about Adam. The purpose of learning about Adam and Eve is not to learn about Adam and Eve. It's to learn about ourselves. The whole purpose of the creation narrative and the temple is to learn about ourselves as Adam and Eve, our nature with God. So we're learning about Adam. And, we went through this kind of history of, maybe Adam's situation, the world in the time of Adam was a little bit different than we're taught in, a 7-year-old in a primary. Maybe there's more complexity there. But the idea is that, hey, Adam also was a restorationist, like all these prophetic heads. He was bringing the gospel to a fallen world. He was restoring an eternal priesthood order to the world. And anytime you have these dispensation heads, they're symbolically also Adams. So, like, the Adam of our dispensation is Joseph Smith, right? He is an Adam of sorts, right? Where he restored Christ's church, and the priesthood keys were given to him, and as he brings people into the family of Israel, right, we're symbolically becoming part of Joseph Smith's family, right, in a priesthood sense, right, because he restored the Christ's priesthood order in this dispensation. So we're symbolically the family of Joseph Smith. Of course, his keys date back to other prophets who date back to Adam, and we're all part of this priesthood family of Adam. So, while yes, we could say Adam and Eve were the parents of all living, like that's an idea. You can take that very literally, and you can go down that very primary way of thinking. But another way of thinking about it is Adam was the priesthood patriarch of all those who enter into the priesthood order, to the covenant family. And you start thinking like this, and the gospel and the doctrine of Christ and what you read in the scriptures becomes less of a fairy tale and more an understanding of the priesthood order and how it is organized and works among men, and how God reveals it to man to bring man back into the presence and the image and likeness of God. So continuing on, we have we can look at Adam and Eve as archetypes. So we discussed that, yeah, there is some real person who is an Adam and Eve, right? We have symbolic Adam and Eves, and there was some literal Adam and Eve at some point, right? Who was the Adam and Eve that at the beginning, 6,000 years ago. But in more of a temple sense, we have Adam and Eve as archetypes, as models of man. And one big revelation, that we get from Doctrine and Covenants and in the temple is that Adam is the archangel Michael. And so we have like the pre-existence narrative of Michael the archangel, and then we have an understanding that he condescended to earth, partook of fruit, and entered into a celestial society, a celestial sphere, and became Adam. Started a new life. And this is very important because who was Michael? And we know great archangel, okay, but what is, in Hebrew, the name Michael means who is like God. So we have Adam, we have Michael, who is a being like God, right? You can essentially say a God. If you're like God, you're a God. Yeah, we could throw a lowercase g on that to not offend anybody. But we have Michael, who was like God. Well, we know how someone becomes like God, right? We just talked about it, right? Through the priesthood order and through time and experience, and most importantly, the redemptive power of the atonement of Christ, the eternal order of the Son of God, man can become like God. And then we have Michael, who is like God, an exalted being. We have the narrative of him becoming Adam. And this is not so much scriptural as it is temple now. Like, we get the identity we have in the scriptures and Doctrine and Covenants and whatnot, but the temple narrative of creation and the Garden of Eden, it's significant. It's very, very specifically pointed out that Adam was Michael before this process of creation and the garden and the fall happened, right? So we can understand. So as we study the creation, we have two different ways of studying it, right? We can study what was the process that Michael went through as an exalted being, going through the fall and then inheriting an earth and peopling it and promoting the priesthood throughout his posterity. And then we also have the model of who am I as an Adam, like being born as a fallen man with no memory of a past life. Like, what is my process of seeking redemption? Both of those stories were being told in the narrative of creation. And if you can study one or the other and learn very different things, both about yourself, like you can learn things about who you are now, and you can learn things about who you can become through this priesthood order.
Yeah, I love this idea of essentially two narratives being interwoven as one. And actually, it's important to think about it because as you go through the creation narrative and go through the endowment, it actually, I think, simplifies or organizes what is being taught a little bit better so that you can understand there are truths being taught in the endowment and through the creation narrative that are applicable to the Michael coming down, condescending and coming down as Adam. And then the maybe the more immediate applicability to us today of Adam, then once a fall occurs, right? And then Adam seeking to enter back into that order of God and receiving further light and knowledge from God directly, or messengers, from God. That's more applicable to us today. That being said, it doesn't mean that both narratives being taught about Adam and Eve as a consequence of that as well, that both won't apply to us at some point in the future, right? Like that's actually could potentially be very instructive, and something to keep an open mind about is this narrative that's being taught has applicability to us now, and that may also have significant future applicability to us into the eternities, right? And kind of what we may be tasked or called to go through as our eternal progression continues forward, right? So just several different things to consider as we think about this creation narrative.
Yeah, and continuing the idea of archetypes, you also have the idea of first and last Adam, which is an idea that Paul teaches, I think, in Corinthians, if I'm not mistaken. I didn't write down the reference, but he talks about the first Adam, meaning Adam who fell, the fallen man, and he talks about Christ as the last Adam, Christ as the exalted man who overcame the effects of the fallen man. So you have the first man and the last man. You have fallen man and exalted man, right? That's the beginning and end state of the plan of salvation, right? And Christ is the perfect archetypal representation of exaltation of the perfect man and what the priesthood order is meant to help us become. And as Christ was resurrected and became glorified, I think you could argue that he became like God in every sense. He became Michael, like God, like Elohim, right? And so the idea of Adam and Michael as archetypes that overlap, but this is the eternal round, right? It's beginning and end. In the beginning, it's always happening, right? So you have Adam becoming Michael, and you have Michael becoming Adam, right? You have this process of these archetypes flowing into each other. And with that in mind, right, as the two different types of archetypes, like that's how you can start really going to the temple or reading these creation narratives and getting depth out of it, and getting and pondering and receiving revelation and what's relevant to me now, and what is promised for me to be able to become if I continue down the path of the gospel. So Christ is a Michael. I got my bullet points here I wanted to talk. So Christ himself is a Michael. We have Michael the archangel before, but then we have Christ as a new Michael, right? He becomes a Michael. So turning this into a temple context, the thought is the process of the temple, or this priesthood order that we enter into in the temple, right? It is the process by which telestial Adams, fallen man, telestial Adams, right, can turn into celestial Michaels, right? And then in the idea of the eternal round, it's also the idea that celestial Michaels then condescend to promote eternal posterity and propagate righteousness and the priesthood order through the eternities. So we have the creation, and we have the Garden of Eve. So we're going to talk about a few more aspects from Michael's perspective and from Adam's perspective, now that we've kind of identified that there's two different ways to think about it. So we have the Garden of Eden. From Michael's perspective, he was in a celestial state, right? He walked with God. Okay. He was a celestial being. And he was in the garden. Adam and Eve were without sin and immortal. They were redeemed, exalted beings, immortal, right? Could not die. And they enjoyed their inheritance, the garden, which the Lord had prepared for them, that they inherited from the Lord. They enjoyed their inheritance until they chose to do something greater, to do something different. Let's say different, because I'm sure the Garden of Eden was pretty great. But the whole, and this isn't new. Anyone who's LDS, this isn't a new concept. That partaking of the fruit, was a transgression, not a sin. It was it's a necessary step of the plan of salvation. Why? Because the plan of salvation is condescension, is going into a fallen world and having children and offering them redemption through the priesthood order of the Son of God. Right? That is the plan of salvation. That is the plan of God. So from Michael's perspective,
Yeah, this gets to. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Finish.
Yeah, I was just gonna repeat the value. So from Michael's perspective, right? Celestial being in the garden, enjoying his inheritance, and when the time was appropriate, when they felt it was right, they made the decision to condescend from their inheritance into telestial society to do the work of glory of God.
This is obviously another thing, a small but a very large departure from the rest of Christianity, the idea that Adam and Eve did not sin, and in the way in which it's normally taught in the rest of Christianity theology. But what Joseph Smith clarified, and we've continued to maintain to this day, is that this was a transgression. Transgression meaning this was a choice that required condescension to a lesser degree of glory than celestial, right? And it actually kind of goes through, I wasn't planning on bringing this up, but you and I have kind of talked about, and you've kind of theorized this idea that like celestial beings can only procreate physically outside of a celestial state of being, that like Adam and Eve getting to enjoy a celestial inheritance, but realizing in order to continue the eternal round, in order to progress and continue to have this eternal posterity, that they had to actively choose, right, to condescend and to then kick off another eternal round where they bring physical life, man, into the world, and then begin the plan of redemption once again for these beings. And that is such a profound thought to me, because the implications of why one must be chaste, why one must learn to control their appetites and their passions, why we have to live to abide certain attributes and certain laws, depending on the sphere in which we live. There's a lot of there's very instructive application there, if that is the case, and also helps us understand why Adam and Eve would have made that choice, right? There was a real logical thought behind it. Again, not to get caught up in the other part of the narrative that we get shown in the creation, where Eve is deceived, and the serpent fooled her into doing this thing. That's more applicable to us today, right? That's the part of the narrative that would be more applicable to us now, not necessarily something that would have been applicable to an eternal being who had received a celestial glory, but chose, right, then to condescend and come down.
Yeah. And again, there's two narratives going on here. Right now we're talking about Michael's perspective as the archangel, as one who is like God. Okay? And
right.
He's interesting thought, right? Archangel. Arc, like an arc. Like he's arcing from one degree of glory to another. Okay. He's an archangel. And yeah, no, that was deeper than I was planning on going, but that certainly seems that certainly seems to be the case, right? If Michael's an exalted being, then of course Adam and Eve had procreative abilities in the garden. But why wouldn't they use them there? Well, seemingly the ordinance of resurrection, of exaltation, comes with a covenant of chastity. Sound familiar? It's very important to have self-control, right? Because it is the will of God that children be born into a degree of glory where they can be tested and perfected before entering into celestial glory. So those who partake of celestial glory you receive all the benefits of godhood, right? That's the power of redemption. That's the power of the atonement of Christ. But the priesthood order places limitations on how you use those powers of procreation. So part of what we're doing right now when we go to the temple is we enter into covenants and we're observed. We have judges of Israel who observe, are we capable of self-control? Are we capable of living these certain celestial laws, these higher laws? Because if we're given this great inheritance of celestial glory, right, there's an expectation, there's a requirement that we have the agency and self-control to live those celestial laws. So what we see with Michael...
Now, let's just say...
I wish we knew Eve's name before she was Eve. He's gonna...
We should caveat that we could be wrong about all of this.
No, we don't need to caveat that.
You feel that confident in it, huh?
Oh, I think it's perfectly clear that we might be wrong about a lot of things. Moon base
Agreed.
being one of them. Moonship being one of them.
That's probably the most logical thing we've talked about today.
That's what makes the most sense. Okay, so we have the garden from Michael's perspective. Now we have the garden from Adam, man's perspective, or our perspective, right? We are telestial beings, fallen beings, like distant from the presence of God, right? The temple tells us, as we go through this creation narrative, to consider ourselves as Adam and Eve. So when we talk about the garden perspective, right, as that we go through, right, one way of thinking about it might be that the Garden of Eden represents, creation of Adam represents birth. The Garden of Eden represents our childhood of innocence. And then the fall of Adam and Eve represents us coming into age of accountability and being able to discern good and evil and being offered the opportunity of priesthood and redemption through Christ. Like the whole purpose here is we're learning about the need of priesthood and atonement.
This is the part about again the understanding these two narratives being taught simultaneously, and just like Christ to teach the parables, and there was always multiple layers and deeper truths to gain in each of those parables. The mainstream Christian idea that the story of Adam and Eve illustrates just how terrible and awful we really are, and how it's just God being magnanimous, that he's like, you know what, I guess I'll go ahead and save you guys. You don't deserve it, but I'll throw you a bone, and you can come back and live in heaven with me if you accept Christ. And then you have this understanding of, no, we were designed purposely with a perspective of, yes, they're going to mess up. Yes, they're going to suck for a little while. But through the plan of redemption and through the holy order that is infinite and eternal, they can come back into our presence and be like us, right? That's the point that we talked about earlier, right? And so if we don't understand this narrative, you can have some, like many people have, they just read the Bible account, the biblical creation narrative, and they interpret it as we're basically good for nothing. And God just thankfully has chosen, like, hey, maybe I can save some of you, right? Instead of our perspective of, no, you are all truly children of God that he seeks to redeem, because there is an even greater purpose for you in the eternities, right? There's an infinite and eternal purpose that also glorifies him in what he offers and what he can provide. That's so different than what mainstream Christianity provides. And it's all kind of contained within these two narratives that are playing out here in this story. I watched a debate recently of an LDS guy very cordially debating a Catholic, a very, what would you say, very prominent Catholic theologian. And one of the things that I found most just interesting about the debate is this idea of us truly being in the LDS theology, truly being children of God, like literal children of God. And in other Christian minds, Catholics being one of them, that we are simply just creatures created by a God that he then seeks to provide some semblance of happiness for in the eternities, right? And you don't understand and appreciate just how literal and how important that idea is, that we are his children, because it completely changes the nature of our relationship with God. And other Christians don't understand. And simply some creature that was created by God at his will and pleasure, and that he just he seemed to save some of those creatures periodically, and in this narrative we see here in Adam and Eve, we clearly see that relationship, that father parent child relationship, and just how important it is to understand the divine potential, not guarantee, but the divine potential that each of us has through this narrative that plays out. Did I cut out that time? Could you hear me?
It's pretty good.
Okay, good.
So we have like the garden experience through Michael's perspective and our perspective. And now we have the idea of the fall from the garden to a celestial or fallen state. And from Michael's perspective, and we've already hinted at this, right? We already talked about this a little bit, but right, we know that Adam and Eve, right, it was intentional. Remember the intentional condescension, right? Even when we say Eve was deceived, she was deceived by the truth. By the potential of what could be, and made a choice, right? So like we say she was deceived, but she was presented information from a source that was not God, and she made a choice to pursue that, right? But what does that show? It shows that it was intentional, right? Knowledge was given, and it was an intentional condescension. That makes more sense when we're talking about us being sinful, right? That, we were given temptation and we choose to sin. From Michael's perspective, though, it's what we need to understand is that it was an intentional choice. So Adam and Eve, as exalted beings, they already understood how the plan worked. They already understood what was necessary, what needed to happen. And when it was time, when they chose to do so, it was intentional. Now, I'm throwing out here's my thesis, is that the fall of Adam and Eve, right, this partaking of fruit, so to speak, it is a priesthood ordinance. Like when we're talking about condescension, it's a priesthood ordinance. It's something that has to happen that's integral to the plan of salvation. But this isn't part of the plan of salvation that we participate in. It's part of a higher order of priesthood, which I refer to as the priesthood order of the Father. Doctrine and Covenants talks about there being higher priesthood orders that we enter into in the celestial kingdom. And I believe what we're seeing play out with Michael in the garden are ordinances of this higher order of priesthood. So this idea that you have your exaltation, but at some point you choose to condescend so that man may be, so that you can have posterity and build posterity in righteousness, right? That's a very specific and sacred thing that happens that you do intentionally by covenant. And then because what happens from there, right? Adam partakes of the fruit. The choice has been made. God introduces them to their lower sphere where they're going to do the work and glory of God of producing children, men, sons and daughters, and bringing them into the presence of God. But what happens? Now Adam steps into this fallen world. He becomes the prophet of this fallen world. He becomes the lawgiver. He becomes the revelator of what God gave him in his previous life that he didn't talk about by covenant, right? He only revealed he was Adam and Adam on Diamond, right, is what we're told. So he lived this life as Adam without revealing who he was. And now, right, he's given the law of obedience, the law of sacrifice, a lower priesthood order, the priesthood order of the Son, that he can give to his posterity, his offspring, his children. He can now propagate the priesthood order and bring souls into the likeness of God. And he can teach them the laws of the celestial kingdom, the law of obedience. He can teach them the principles of redemption, the law of sacrifice, and how that works. And he's now in a position to enact the work and glory of the Father.
The idea here, or the intention of the fall from Michael's perspective, again, I think this has a lot of, there's a lot of connect issue here, Tori, and what is...
There's a lot of, it's connected to what?
The initiatory ordinance and the promised blessings that are provided in the initiatory, and how we have a tendency to think that these blessings, once we achieve a certain degree of glory, these blessings are just given to us and everything is going to be easy street, man. And like, it's so chill and there's not going to be any issues. And then with this story of like Michael and then Adam and Eve, you realize, no, there's still a lot of work and there's still a priesthood burden of placed upon us.
A priesthood burden?
Further the work of salvation. A priesthood burden? Is that, I don't know if that's the right term.
No, what?
But here's what I'm going to say is,
yeah.
Is it cutting out? Sorry, I apologize.
Just a little bit.
But yeah, just this concept, just concept of, we are promised certain blessings, but that doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Right. That there's going to be sacrifice and selflessness and charity that's required from us all throughout the stages of eternity, where we give up of ourselves so that our posterity and others can have an opportunity for salvation.
We have the hymn, "Put Your Shoulder to the Wheel," and
I kind of like that.
In Portuguese, like, how do you translate that? Because you don't really have pioneer culture here, And they translated it, our law is to work. That's what it says. Nossa lei é de trabalhar. Our law is work.
Oh.
So that, in Portuguese at least, that's a doctrine. Law.
Interesting.
Is you get the celestial kingdom, and what's the reward? More work.
More work. I like it.
You just get the blessing of remembering all the work you've done up to that point. Eternal life. That's how. Okay, so the fall from our perspective, fallen man, celestial man, is we enter an age of accountability. We enter a fallen, sinful state around the age of 8, we are told. I think, give or take, perhaps. But we enter into this world with a need for redemption, because we enter into this world, right, needing to overcome our passions, the natural man. And we all sin, we all fall short, and we need redemption. Okay, so that is the fallen Adam of the narrative. And we require the law of obedience. Right? We need truth revealed to us so we can truly have discernment and use our agency. It's necessary to have prophets that have this knowledge, these truth, and that they teach us these principles and give us commandments so that we can use our gift of agency and discernment and choose righteousness. It's necessary to have the laws and the law of obedience given to us. And we require the law of sacrifice, meaning we require redemption through the priesthood order of the Son. We require this order to be established, and for one to come as Savior and Redeemer and make that sacrifice that has the power to enter into our hearts and enact change and enact righteousness to the degree necessary to become like God. Right? We require those things because we're born into this world sinful, right? This telestial world and this fallen state. And that's kind of how we look at fallen Adam, right? Oh, he's no longer, he fell from the presence of God. He'll never make it. He'll never make it back. He can't get there. All right. That's where we find ourselves as Adams.
This is the one of the most hopeful messages, I think, out of this creation narrative and what we see in the endowment. This creation narrative is played out. We see the fall occur. But even before the fall happens, even before that, what we are shown in the endowment is there was already a plan in place for once the fall happens, there will be a savior provided, right? That's very clearly taught and demonstrated. And what does that show us? It should give us hope, and it should give us an understanding that God knows we fall short. He knows we're not celestial beings yet, but that everything has been designed with the intent to perfect us, right? And, you and I have talked about this a lot, but the plan of redemption was not the backup plan. That wasn't the just in case. If things go sideways, this is what we'll do if we get in a pinch, But the plan of redemption and everything that it encompasses, the fact that we are weak, the fact that we are natural men and women, that we make mistakes, that we fall short, but that a sacrifice was given, that a savior was provided, that grace exists so that we can overcome that natural man. That's the greatest, most hopeful aspect of the creation narrative in the endowment, is that a savior will be provided and that the law of sacrifice is given, because this is always the plan and it works every time, and you aren't a mistake. There's not something so wrong with you that you can't be redeemed, because that's not true. You are redeemable and you are worth redeeming. God has designed this entire process for you to be redeemed. And that amount of hope and trust in the Lord's plan and in the grace he lovingly provides, we can never lose sight of that and never lose hope in that, because it is possible. And you can then truly overcome the natural man or woman within yourself and be transformed and go from image of God into the order of God to be like God. That's such a profound thing that I hope people can take out of this, is that all of it is available to you and you're not past redemption. You have not fallen that far, because this has been pre-designed eternities ago, well before you ever sinned or ever made mistakes. There is a path forward for you, and hopefully that provides hope and joy for those who feel like, why can't I just figure this out? Well, God's been planning for your salvation for eternities now. Don't lose hope. Keep going forward one step at a time.
Well, and that's what's beautiful about it, is that the plan itself is eternal, without beginning or end.
That's right.
We talk about it being a plan, but it's just it is the way. It's how things work. It's how eternal progression happens. It's as eternal as God himself. And and you know what? We've talked about a lot of things. We threw out some crazy ideas. We speculated on some things. But the takeaway we wanted to get out of this episode, hopefully it happened, is that, like, you take something as as fundamental and well known as the creation narrative and Garden of Eden and the fall of Adam and Eve, a very basic, fundamental Christian idea. And what the temple is designed to help us do is get depth out of it, and to be able to take those symbols, that allegory, and have it transform us. And what we're trying to show here today is that you can go to the temple, you can learn about Adam and Eve, you can learn about the Garden of Eden and the fall, and you can think about it in many different ways, and you can find great, profound depth in it that can be inspiring and motivating in a way that can push you forward in being a better follower of Jesus Christ and taking advantage of the blessings of the gospel and the priesthood order that is offered us. Right? The purpose of the temple is to take Adam, fallen Adams, and turn them into exalted Michaels. Okay? That's what the temple is designed to do. That's what the gospel is designed to do. That's what the priesthood order of Jesus Christ is designed to do, is to walk us through this process and to give us tools, these ordinances, that could enter into our souls and inspire us and lift us up and help us learn how to be righteous individuals, and to have godly integrity and character, and to propagate that into the future and through eternity. And my testimony is that the temple is powerful. And these narratives and these ideas, right, they have a power beyond just the history or the story it's telling, but they are pure revelation and priesthood tools that are given to us that produce the expected results, that produce change of our natures, that help us overcome fallen man and overcome our sinful natures and become redeemed individuals. Become individuals that are without sin. Not because we haven't sinned, but because the power of Christ can erase sin. It can make us sinless. And I testify that these things are true. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.